Hello, and welcome to Just About Earth. This is a place for quiet curiosity, a place to let the mysteries of our past unfold without any hurry. Our journey tonight starts under a sky that's been watching this planet for a lot longer than we've been telling stories about it. That same sky was here before we had cities, before we had calendars, long before the first history book was ever written. If you just let yourself imagine it for a second, you can almost feel that sky looking down on people whose names we'll never know. People who might have shaped the very world you and I are living in right now, but left no signature behind. This isn't the kind of mystery that hides in the shadows or deals in secrets. It's something quieter, almost polite. It's the kind of mystery that stands in plain sight, just waiting for you to notice it. Scattered all across the surface of our world are clues. Some are etched into stone, some are carried in the patterns of old maps, and some are hidden inside myths that have been told so often nobody remembers who told them first. Tonight, we're going to follow those clues, and they're all going to lead us toward a simple but incredibly powerful question. What if an entire civilization lived, thrived, and even shaped our world, and we've just forgotten they ever existed? Before we start looking for those hints together, I'd like you to just take a moment and picture where you are right now. Maybe you're sitting somewhere comfortable with a drink. Maybe you're unwinding after a long day, not quite ready for sleep. Maybe your eyes are half on this screen and half on something else in the room. I'd love to know what the sky looks like outside your window. If it's night where you are, maybe you can see a few stars. If it's daytime, just imagine those same stars are still there, hanging just behind the blue, waiting for their turn. Thousands of years ago, someone might have looked at that exact same patch of sky and used it to decide when to plant their crops or when to set out on a long journey. Those same stars might have been the guide for someone building a monument we still walk past today, without fully understanding why it was put there in the first place. If you enjoy letting your mind wander through questions like this, the kind of slow questions that don't need to be answered in a rush, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video or maybe subscribe. It really does help this small corner of calm find other people who want to think about the past in the same thoughtful way. When you think about history, you probably picture a neat, straight line, with all the major events placed in order like beads on a string. There's a start, there's an end, and everything in between is connected in a clear, logical path. But that's just one way to see it. Imagine instead that history is a layered picture. The top layer is the one we know well, the names of empires, the famous inventions, the great migrations. But underneath that, there could be other layers that we've barely even started to notice. One of those hidden layers might hold a civilization far older than we think is possible. One that developed skills and knowledge that made their way into our world quietly, passed from hand to hand, until their origin was completely lost to time. You can actually see the edges of this possibility in certain ruins. There are ancient sites where archaeologists agree that the main structure belongs to a known culture, like the Incas or the Romans. But the base it sits on, the foundation stones, they just don't match. Sometimes, the blocks at the bottom are gigantic, far larger than anything the later builders would have used. Sometimes, they're fitted together so precisely, without any mortar, that you can't even slip a razor blade between them, while the newer work built on top looks rough and crude by comparison. One simple explanation is that later builders just reused old stones left by whoever came before them. And if that's true, it means those earlier builders were there long before we have any names for them. This isn't something you find in just one place. It happens all over the world. You see walls where one part is a tidy, even pattern and another part is made of these huge, irregular blocks. You find cities with layers that just don't quite match in style or material. And every time, the same question just hangs in the air. Who built the first part? Before written language, the only way to preserve knowledge was to tell it, to pass it down through stories. And every single retelling was a chance for details to get changed or lost. Without written records, just a few generations could pass, and a major event could shift from a remembered fact into a half-remembered story. From there, it could become a legend, and finally a myth, until the real people and the real events were completely invisible under all those layers of storytelling. Archaeology has to work with what survives, and survival is incredibly uneven. An object made of stone might be buried for thousands of years and come out in perfect condition, while something from the exact same time vanishes completely because it was made of wood or cloth. If a civilization built mainly with wood in a wet climate, their cities might have just dissolved back into the earth. If they wrote on something that rotted or burned easily, their words would be gone forever. So, we're left with pieces. And sometimes, those pieces just don't fit the timeline we already believe in. An object might seem way too advanced for its age. A building technique might show up long before we think it should have been invented. When this happens, researchers have a choice. They can try to force it to fit into the known story. They can suggest the dating was wrong, or they can just set it aside as an anomaly, something unexplained. But every single one of these objects, every one of these structures, has a real origin. And in some cases, that origin might point back to people we don't know about yet. Now, if a civilization like this did exist, they might not have been the massive, empire-building type we're used to reading about. They could have been smaller groups, spread out across huge distances, linked not by political borders, but by shared knowledge. Instead of conquering territory, maybe they specialized in things like navigation, farming, astronomy, or making incredible tools. They might have shared their discoveries in a way that let other cultures adopt them and eventually claim them as their own. Their influence would have been subtle, almost invisible. Maybe they were the ones who first traded the seeds that became the crops we still depend on today. Maybe they showed others how to shape stone in a way that would make it last for centuries. Maybe they passed along methods for measuring the seasons or tracking the stars, knowledge that eventually got woven into religious or cultural traditions. If you really think about it, influence doesn't need a name attached to it to survive. You probably use a tool every single day without knowing who invented it. You might follow a family tradition without having any idea how it started. Now, multiply that effect across thousands of years, and it's easy to see how an entire civilization could just fade from memory, while their impact on the world remained. We also have to remember just how much of our own planet we haven't explored in detail yet. Huge areas of the ocean floor are still completely unmapped. Dense rainforests can hide entire cities from our satellites. Deserts have swallowed ruins whole, burying them under tons of sand. Even in places we think we know like the back of our hand, surprises still surface all the time. A road construction crew uncovers ancient walls just a few feet below the ground. A severe drought lowers the water level in a lake, revealing the foundations of buildings we never knew were there. Every time this happens, it's a powerful reminder that we are still just scratching the surface of our own story. It's entirely possible that we have walked right over or sailed right past the remains of such a civilization without ever recognizing them. Without context, an ancient structure might just look like a natural rock formation. A carved stone could be dismissed as a coincidence of erosion. An unusual artifact might get labeled as out of place and left to gather dust in a museum storage room, forgotten. The scale of what gets left behind really depends on how people lived. If they were nomadic and moved often, they probably wouldn't have built massive, permanent cities. If they blended in with the cultures that came after them, their unique style might have been absorbed until it was no longer recognizable. And if they valued natural, biodegradable materials, then almost everything they ever made could be gone, except for the rare piece that was buried or sheltered by pure chance. This is where the idea moves beyond just being fun speculation. It actually changes how we think about the concept of progress. We like to imagine that human knowledge moves in a steady, upward climb, always getting better, always advancing. But history shows us again and again that knowledge can be lost. Skills can completely disappear when they're no longer passed down from one generation to the next. Entire fields of expertise can vanish in the blink of an eye. If there was a high point of knowledge long, long ago, and it was followed by a period of decline, later societies might have had to rediscover some of that knowledge, without ever knowing they were just rebuilding something that had been built before. That possibility makes the world around us feel different, doesn't it? It means that something as ordinary as the way a road curves could be part of a design that was first laid out by people who vanished before recorded history. It means that a farming technique used in one part of the world might actually have its roots in a place thousands of miles away, carried there by hands we can't name. And once you start to see the world this way, it's really hard to stop noticing the patterns. A symbol carved into a stone in one country looks almost identical to one found thousands of kilometers away. A very specific kind of joint in woodworking shows up in cultures separated by entire oceans. A story told to children in one language has almost the exact same structure as one told in another, with only the names and the local details changed. Now, all of these things could have happened independently. Of course, human beings are pretty clever. We often come up with similar solutions to similar problems, but sometimes the similarities are just too precise to ignore. When they line up too well, and they appear in places that had no known connection, it opens the door to the idea that someone, or some group, made that connection long before we ever realized it was possible. And maybe, just maybe, they left more behind than we've noticed so far. Maybe the next huge discovery won't be a giant golden treasure or a towering pyramid, but a small, ordinary-looking object that forces us to rethink our entire timeline. When you start to look for these patterns, you realize that some of the oldest parts of our world don't announce themselves loudly. They don't shout their existence from the rooftops like a modern skyscraper or a giant billboard. They murmur. They let time soften their edges. They settle into the landscape so well that you're not quite sure if you're looking at something made by human hands or something carved by the slow, patient work of wind and water. And in many cases, that's how they've managed to survive for so long. Think about how a story can survive in your own family. Maybe your grandparents told you something they heard from their parents, and over time, the details got a little fuzzy. A name might have been forgotten. The setting might have been changed to a more familiar place. A real person might have been turned into a bit of a legend. By the time that story gets to you, it feels half real and half imagined. But somewhere, buried deep under all those changes, there's a kernel of truth. The exact same thing happens to the memory of entire civilizations. Without writing, the main way to pass down history was to speak it, to turn it into something memorable enough to be told over and over again. And the easiest way to make something memorable is to give it some drama. You make the heroes larger than life. You make the events more spectacular. You add a little bit of danger or romance. You make it a story worth repeating. The trouble is, while the story becomes more entertaining, the details that were once historical facts start to bend and warp. Over thousands of years, a perfectly ordinary leader can become a mythical king who ruled for centuries. A skilled navigator becomes someone who could command the wind and the waves. A city built with careful engineering becomes a magical place raised overnight by gods. What was once a straightforward history becomes a part of the shared mythology of the culture. And after enough time has passed, people just stop asking if any of it really happened. This is where the whisper hides. Not in the parts of the story that are too fantastical to believe, but in the pieces that feel strangely practical. The parts that don't need magic to work, but seem oddly advanced for the time period they're supposed to come from. Details like knowing exactly when the rainy season will start, or how to predict an eclipse, or how to build something that will last for centuries without collapsing. Those details might be all that's left of the real knowledge passed down from people who were gone long before the storytellers even knew their names. Some researchers have spent their entire careers sifting through ancient myths to find these practical threads. They compare stories from different parts of the world, looking for similarities that just shouldn't be there. When two cultures separated by oceans both tell a similar tale about a great flood, it might just be dismissed as a coincidence. After all, floods happen everywhere. But when the details of the stories line up a little too closely, it becomes much harder to ignore. The same is true for stories about strange visitors from the sky, about sudden leaps in technology, or about incredible cities that vanished beneath the sea. In some traditions, there are stories about beings who come from far away, teach important skills like farming or building, and then disappear. Sometimes they're described as gods, sometimes as wise strangers. Sometimes they have no description at all, only that they were different. These stories might be pure invention, of course. Or they might be the distant, distorted memory of contact with a group of people who had knowledge that others didn't have yet. Then there's the way certain symbols appear in places with no known connection. Spirals, for example, show up in ancient art from Ireland, in the petroglyphs of the American Southwest, and in the carvings of the Pacific Islands. Image collage of spiral symbols from different ancient cultures. Maybe the spiral is just a natural, universal shape for the human mind to create. It mirrors the patterns we see in shells and whirlpools and galaxies. But maybe it's also something that traveled from place to place, carried by people long ago. Language itself can hold these whispers. A single word in one language might have a twin in another, spoken thousands of kilometers away, with a meaning that hasn't changed much at all. Sometimes these similarities can be explained through known trade routes or migrations. But other times, the link is much harder to trace. If a now-lost civilization traveled widely, teaching and trading as they went, they could have left fragments of their language scattered in the places they visited. Those fragments could be hiding in plain sight today, disguised as local words that no one realizes have a much, much older origin. We also find these whispers in the physical layout of ancient sites. Some of them align perfectly with the movements of the sun, the moon, or specific stars. In certain cases, the precision is so high that even modern engineers are impressed. How could people with what we consider simple tools have possibly achieved that level of accuracy? Sometimes we figure it out and realize they had incredibly clever, low-tech methods that worked remarkably well. But other times, we're still not entirely sure. And in those cases, it's tempting to wonder if they learned those techniques from someone else, someone who had already mastered them. The trouble is, for every one of these tantalizing clues, there are dozens of more ordinary explanations. An unusual artifact might just be the result of a known culture experimenting with new materials. A symbol found in two distant places might have been invented separately by pure coincidence. A story about a vanished city might be a metaphor for something else entirely, like a lost golden age. And so, the idea of an unknown, ancient civilization remains just that, an idea, unless enough of these scattered pieces start to connect into something more solid. Still, the number of these unexplained pieces is slowly growing. Every single year, new discoveries are made that challenge our established timelines. A site in South America turns out to be thousands of years older than we thought. A tool shows up in a place it shouldn't be. A genetic study suggests contact between two populations that were supposed to be completely isolated from each other. These aren't wild fantasies published on some obscure corner of the internet. They are documented shifts in our understanding, brought about by real evidence that forces historians and archaeologists to adjust the story they've been telling. You might think this would mean we're getting closer to a complete, final picture of the past. But the more we learn, the more we realize just how much we don't know. For every single question we answer, several more seem to pop up in its place. How did they do this? Why did they leave that behind? And the biggest question of all, where did they go? Sometimes the answer could be surprisingly simple. Maybe they didn't vanish at all. Maybe they just became part of the cultures that came after them. Their name and their distinct identity might have disappeared, but their knowledge, their bloodlines, their influence, it all lived on, absorbed into the next chapter of history. In other cases, they might have been wiped out by a catastrophe, a series of massive floods, a chain of earthquakes. A devastating disease could have left only a handful of survivors who simply couldn't maintain the same level of technology or social organization. And then there's the much stranger possibility that they deliberately erased themselves from history. Maybe they left because they wanted to. Maybe they hid their presence because they believed it was safer for those who came after them to think that the knowledge was their own discovery. It's hard for us to imagine why anyone would choose to be forgotten. But there are hints in our own known history that sometimes people do just walk away from everything they've built. There are abandoned cities from well-known cultures that were left perfectly intact, with no signs of war or disaster. The people just moved on. If an unknown civilization once did the same thing on a larger scale, the only record of them might be what they chose to leave behind. And if they didn't want to be remembered, maybe they made sure that record was very, very hard to find. What's so striking is how much this idea changes the way you look at familiar things. It means that what we see as the beginning of a culture's story might actually be the middle. It means that the great leaps forward in technology that we celebrate might have actually been small steps back towards something that was once common knowledge. It means that the myths we dismiss as simple entertainment might be holding on to fragments of real, forgotten history. And if that's true, then every ruined wall, every half-buried tool, every strange word in an old language becomes more than just a curiosity. It becomes part of a much, much larger puzzle. When we think about puzzles, we usually imagine having all the pieces in a box, ready to be assembled. But with history, most of the pieces are missing. Some are probably in the wrong box entirely, and some are so worn down by time that you can't even tell where they're supposed to fit. The whisper of a civilization before history is like the picture on that puzzle box, a picture that's been faded by the sun almost to nothing. You can still make out a few shapes, maybe a hint of color here and there, but not nearly enough to be sure what the whole thing is supposed to look like, and yet that faint outline is there. We just have to decide if we're willing to look closely enough to see it, and whether we're ready for the possibility that the final picture is nothing like the one we thought we were building. Some discoveries make perfect sense the moment they're found. They fit neatly into the expected time period, they match the known technology of the culture, and they line up perfectly with what we already understand about the past. And then there are the others, the ones that seem to have arrived ahead of schedule, or ended up far from where they should be, or were found in the hands of people who, according to our current history, shouldn't have had them at all. These are the out-of-place objects, artifacts that challenge the neat timeline we've built for ourselves. They can be small things. A metal tool found in a layer of earth dated thousands of years before that type of metalwork was supposedly invented. A ceramic shard in a region where that style is only supposed to have developed much, much later. But they can also be large. Sections of a wall built using construction techniques that hadn't been invented yet, or carved statues made from materials sourced from a quarry hundreds of miles away, far beyond the known reach of the local culture. In each case, the first reaction from archaeologists is usually to assume there's been a mistake. And a lot of the time that's true. Soil layers can be disturbed by floods or earthquakes, or by later people digging pits. Objects can be moved, reused, or dropped in places far from where they were originally made. And our dating methods, while incredible, can have margins of error. But even after you account for all of those possibilities, there are still a handful of examples that remain stubbornly hard to explain. A finely crafted bronze object found in a site that predates the known use of bronze in that region by centuries. A map fragment showing coastlines in accurate detail long before that kind of mapping should have been possible. One of the most famous examples is a device found in an ancient shipwreck off the coast of Greece in the early 20th century. It's now understood to be a kind of ancient analog computer, a complex system of bronze gears used to predict astronomical events. It dates back more than 2,000 years, and yet its complexity was completely unmatched for over 1,000 years afterward. When it was first discovered, many experts assumed it had to be a modern object that had fallen onto the wreck site, but study after study confirmed its age, leaving us with a device that simply shouldn't exist when and where it did. In the context of an unknown civilization, these out-of-place objects could be the physical leftovers of contact. A trader from a more advanced society might have exchanged goods with a smaller community, leaving behind items that would puzzle archaeologists thousands of years later. Or, survivors from a collapsed culture might have carried their most prized tools with them as they merged into other societies. The real challenge is that these objects are rare. If a forgotten civilization did exist, its physical remnants might be scattered thinly across the world, mixed into the archaeological layers of other cultures. Identifying them requires both luck and the ability to recognize when something just doesn't fit. But history isn't just about physical objects. There's another record we carry with us everywhere we go, whether we realize it or not. It's inside our bodies, in our cells, in the genetic code that determines everything about us. Our DNA is more than just a blueprint for an individual. It's a long, continuous story of where we came from, shaped by every single generation that came before us. Modern genetic research can read this story, showing where different populations mixed and when those interactions happened. Sometimes, the results confirm what we already know from archaeology. But sometimes, they reveal connections between groups of people we thought were completely isolated from each other. One of the clearest examples is the discovery that all non-African humans today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. For years, the theory was that modern humans simply replaced Neanderthals. But the genetic evidence proves that they met, and that those encounters left a permanent mark in our own genes. So, in the context of an unknown civilization, could genetic evidence point to contact with a group that left no other footprint? If a small, distinct population existed somewhere and occasionally mixed with neighboring cultures, their unique DNA could survive in people today, even if every single one of their cities and tools had vanished. This is especially true for seafaring cultures. If a group was skilled at long-distance navigation, they could have visited faraway lands, leaving behind a genetic legacy that spread far beyond their original home. Geneticists even have a term for something that fits this idea perfectly: ghost populations. These are ancient groups that must have existed at some point, because their DNA is present in living people, but we have no direct record of them. No bones, no artifacts, no written accounts. Just a genetic signature that doesn't match any known ancient group. If we think about a possible unknown civilization, these ghost populations could be the faintest, most personal trace they left behind. They might represent a culture that thrived in a region where the climate was too harsh for anything to be preserved, or one that was so completely absorbed into other cultures that all outward signs of their identity disappeared, except for the story written in their DNA. Sometimes you come across a structure that just stops you in your tracks, not just because it's beautiful or ancient, but because it feels like it doesn't belong where or when it is. The technology, the precision, the sheer ambition of it, seems completely out of step with everything else we know about that culture. It's as if a piece of another world was dropped into the timeline, and no one can quite agree on how it got there. We're used to thinking of architectural progress as a steady, upward climb. Simple shelters become huts, which become houses, which become fortresses and temples. But in reality, it's not always that neat. There are these sudden jumps, incredible bursts of innovation that appear without any clear predecessors, and then sometimes they disappear again just as quickly. A great example is the use of those massive stone blocks we talked about earlier, cut and placed with such precision that the seams are almost invisible. At some sites, these blocks weigh dozens, even hundreds of tons. And yet, they are arranged in patterns that suggest not only advanced engineering, but also a deep understanding of seismic stability. They were designed to keep the structure standing through centuries of earthquakes. In other places, we find the oldest parts of a structure are actually the most advanced. Temples built on foundations that are far more precise and durable than the buildings sitting on top of them. Walls where the lower layers are made of expertly fitted megalithic stone, while the upper sections are made of smaller, rougher stones from a much later period. That's the complete reverse of what you'd expect if technology was advancing in a straight line. It's a pattern that suggests a loss of knowledge, or a later culture trying to imitate the work of a much more skilled predecessor. It hints that maybe, just maybe, they were building on the ruins of something they didn't fully understand. This pattern also shows up in the tools themselves. We chart history by the materials used to make tools: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Each step forward opens up new possibilities. But every so often, we find a tool or a device that doesn't fit this neat progression. A level of craftsmanship that seems to require tools and processes that shouldn't exist yet. Consider ancient stonework that shows perfectly smooth, round drill holes with spiral grooves, suggesting a high-speed rotary drill. Recreating that today would require high-quality drill bits and steady power. But in the period these stones are from, the known tools just wouldn't produce those kinds of marks. Or look at metallurgy. There are artifacts from certain periods that show a metal purity or an alloy composition that was supposedly impossible for the technology of the time. Some ancient steel was so well made that it resisted corrosion for centuries. In some cases, modern scientists have only recently figured out how to replicate it, and even then, with great difficulty. These are the tools we literally forgot how to make, and their existence raises two big questions. Who made them? And why did the knowledge of how to make them just disappear? A huge part of the answer might lie in a place we can barely read: the ocean. The ocean is the largest archive on Earth, covering more than 70% of the planet, and most of it is still a complete mystery. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, massive ice sheets melted, and sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, that's over 300 feet. Countless coastal settlements would have been completely swallowed by the rising water. Entire regions that were once dry, habitable land are now on the deep ocean floor. If there ever was an unknown civilization, especially one skilled in seafaring, the ocean may hold most of its secrets. All of its major coastal cities, its harbors, its shipyards, they would all now lie under layers of silt and sand, waiting to be found. And we are finding hints. Sonar has revealed stone formations that look suspiciously like man-made walls, patterns on the seafloor that resemble streets, and shapes that could be the remains of ancient docks. But searching the ocean is incredibly slow and expensive, and proving what you found is even harder. Still, the ocean remains the great keeper of secrets, holding on to the evidence of lives and journeys that may have existed entirely beyond the reach of our current history books. When you look at all these different threads, the out-of-place artifacts, the whispers in our myths and DNA, the impossibly advanced architecture, the lost tools, and the vast, unexplored world beneath the waves, it becomes clear that the story we tell ourselves about the past might be missing its first chapter. The clues don't offer proof, but they do paint a compelling picture. A picture of a people who understood the world in a way that we are only now beginning to appreciate. A people whose influence was so subtle and so deeply embedded into the cultures that followed, that their own identity was lost in the process. Their legacy might not be a single, monumental ruin waiting to be discovered. Instead, it might be the quiet details of our own world. The foundation under the temple, the symbol carved into the rock, the story told around a fire, the strange, familiar echo in our own genes. The unknown civilization, if it existed, might not have left behind a single structure we can point to and say, that was them. But if they shaped the path of human development in ways that still affect us today, then in a very real sense, they are still here. Not as a hidden city or a lost people, but as part of the very foundation of the world we now inhabit. Thank you for spending this time exploring these ideas with me. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey, there are many more paths we can walk down together, and countless more questions to ask. Until next time, take care of yourself, and never stop wondering about the stories the world hasn't told us yet.